evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program, Inside the Cold War, Why It Matters. I'm James Brundage, curator at the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, and I will be your host for this evening's program, which is being offered jointly by the PMML and the International Spy Museum. I'm joined today by Colonel Chris Costa and Dr. Andrew Hammond. Colonel Costa is the Executive Director of the International Spy Museum and a 34-year veteran of the Department of Defense. Previously, he served 25 years in the United States Army, working in counterintelligence, human intelligence, and with special operations forces in Central America, Europe, and throughout the Middle East. He ran a wide range of intelligence and special operations in Panama, Bosnia, the First and Second Iraq Wars, and Afghanistan. Colonel Costa earned 2 Bronze Stars for sensitive human intelligence work in Afghanistan, and later was assigned to the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, where he served as the first civilian squadron deputy director. In 2013, he was inducted into the United States Special Operations Command Hall of Honor for lifetime service to U.S. Special Operations. Most recently, he serves as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Counterterrorism at the National Security Council. Dr. Andrew Hammond is historian and curator at the International Spy Museum. His interest in intelligence came from a period of service in the Royal Air Force with secondments to the British Army and the Royal Navy. He specializes in military and intelligence history, and he is the author of the forthcoming book entitled Struggles for Freedom, Afghanistan and U.S. Foreign Policy since 1979, and is working on another book that tells the story of 9/11 and the post 9/11 wars through the voices of military and intelligence veterans. He has taught at a number of institutions on both sides of the Atlantic and has held fellowships at the British Library, the Library of Congress, New York University, and the University of Warwick. He was formerly a Mellon Public Humanities Fellow at the 9/11 Memorial Museum and is currently a Public Policy Fellow at the Wilson Center. He hosts Spycasts, the museum's podcast. Gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. Dr. Hammond, would you mind starting us out by just telling us a little bit about the Spy Museum before we begin?
Absolutely. Well, I think it would probably be better if you don't mind me changing the running order. Chris, do you want to set the scene for us as we discussed earlier?
Well, I can do that, certainly. It's my favorite topic to talk about. So I'll just say that we opened up in 2002. It was the vision of our founder, Milton Maltz, who served in the National Security Agency in the 1950s. It was his vision that really brought about the Spy Museum back in 2002. We existed in Penn Quarter of DC. If you don't know DC, it's not too far from the National Mall. In May of 2019, on Mother's Day, we moved to the other side of the mall in L'Enfant Plaza in an amazing 140,000 square foot building, 8 floors, and that's where we have an opportunity to tell the how and why of spying, how the techniques, tactics, the procedures, the tradecraft that we're going to talk about tonight, and also the why nations spy. And that's the heart of the Cold War story in many ways. So we are the only public museum in the United States to tackle espionage and intelligence from an international standpoint, from a global standpoint, and we're very proud of that. And we have the largest collection of espionage-related artifacts ever placed on public display. And that's a great segue, really, for Andrew to talk a little bit more about the artifacts and his crucial role at the Spy Museum.
Thanks, Chris. And I will just share my screen. Okay, so this is our new building just off the mall on L'Enfant Plaza. So one of the ways that I like to think about the Spy Museum, look at this amazing building, but this is basically 4 walls. It's the collection that's inside that's truly magnificent, although the outside's pretty snazzy too. And what's inside, if you want to think about it like this, there's amazing stories connected to amazing artifacts. And just for 2 minutes, I'm just going to quickly walk through a few that relate to what we are talking about tonight. So this is one of my favorites. It's a silver cigar box given by Sidney Riley, the gentleman you see at the bottom of your screen, to the gentleman at the top right of your screen, Bruce Lockhart. And this is probably the only physical piece of evidence connecting these two gentlemen with a plot to overthrow the Bolshevik regime. So just think about this in the history of the Cold War. Imagine if there's no Bolshevik regime. And some historians say that the Cold War started back in 1917, back during the Russian Revolution. Others, of course, have a more conventional starting point. We can go from there up to 1940. This ice axe was used, this specific ice axe was used to kill Leon Trotsky. And the Cold War was a number of things, but one of the things that it definitely was an ideological conflict. And within communism, so we had the previous artifact, the beginning, Lenin, Trotsky and Stalin. Lenin dies, Trotsky and Stalin have a struggle. And basically, to cut a long story short, Stalin doesn't want Trotsky to stick around. So basically, he gets killed. The next one, we can jump forward to the 60s and 70s. This is Philby's Trilby hat. So we saw a variety of different artifacts, but it can be fashion, it can be a cigar box, it can be an ice axe. This is the hat that was used by someone that some people have called the spy of the century, Kim Philby. So a famous British MI6 officer who was secretly working for the Soviet Union. John Walker, this is his silver bar that we have. So this is the silver bar that was given to him for his espionage activities. You see him on the top right here. He set up a whole spy ring. And one of the reasons why I've included this is that if you've been following the news at all in the past week, a couple that are connected to the Navy have been charged with espionage. John Walker was paid in part through this silver bar. This couple were paid with Monero, a cryptocurrency. So we can begin to think about the changes in espionage since the Cold War up to now. And then the present day. So these are not artifacts that we have, but the Cold War just bites into the present in so many different ways, some of which we're going to go on to discuss. But you see here on the top left, there's a connection to 9/11. Al-Qaeda are born during the Cold War. On the top right, you see the US, Joe Biden with the premiers of Australia and the UK. This is all about what's happening in the South China Sea. You see that again on the bottom left here. Why is that interesting? Well, what we see now is basically almost a succession struggle amongst great powers that grows out of the Cold War. There's a direct connection to the present international architecture and what the Cold War left behind. And then in the bottom right, we've got the brave new world, the wild west of cyber, which we won't get into. But over the course of our collection, it goes from, like I say, way back, the Russian Revolution, up until the present day. And through each of those artifacts, you can enter a portal into a specific place and time in the Cold War. That's just a rough overview of our collection.
All right, well, thank you so much for the introduction to the museum and to some of the collections here. I am going to briefly just highlight a few of the pieces from the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. We currently have an exhibit, Drawn to Combat, Bill Mauldin and the Art of War, which you can see part of behind me here on my screen. The museum is home to the largest collection of Bill Mauldin's work anywhere in the country. and all of which is digitized on our website. So for folks who might be interested, I'd encourage you to take a look at some point. But I'm just going to share a few of the pieces, kind of highlights of Mauldin's collection here. For anybody who doesn't know about Bill Mauldin, he was an editorial cartoonist at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and then Chicago Sun-Times from 1958 through 1991. So obviously he covered so many of the topics that we may even be talking about tonight, but also, a lot of the main foreign policy issues surrounding the Cold War. And of course, he's a well-known World War II cartoonist as well. But some of the topics that he talks about: strategic arms limitation talks, assault talks from the 1970s. He did pieces. This was done in the early 1970s. Little short clips. This was about same things about the limitation talks. And you can see some of his drawings here, the nuclear arms race as he saw it. And then, of course, some very general topics related to the Cold War, those caught in the middle, and certainly the thawing Cold War that he saw throughout the decades. And a couple more pointed cartoons as well. But these are just, a few of the many, many cartoons that we have in our collection that Mauldin did on the Cold War. They certainly reflect his opinion as far as what was happening, and also a lot of the public perception about, how the country saw what was happening from the, the standpoint of U.S. and certainly Soviet relations. And so now on to our discussion. So I'm going to start with a little bit more of a general question, something that we haven't quite yet talked about. But Dr. Hammond, can we talk about how we actually define the Cold War?
Sure. Well, that could easily be a whole hour, but I'll give the Cliff Notes kind of version. So it's commonly understood as a conflict that took place at the end, between the end of World War II and around 1990-1991, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It involved two blocs antagonistically opposed to one another. Broadly speaking, the West, largely North America and Western Europe, and the East, largely the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the former being democratic and the latter communist. Why is it called a Cold War? Well, it's cold in the sense that general war never broke out between those two antagonistically opposed power blocs, which meant that between them, a lot of the action took place in the realm of intelligence and espionage. So that's one of the reasons why our collection's so rich. And I know Chris has got a doozy of a story that connects into that. Just a couple of brief complicating events around that. So it did take place globally. It was a global Cold War. It was beyond East and West. So from Mozambique and Angola to Cuba to Korea, Vietnam, it took place around the world. It even took place in the Antarctic. The Antarctic Treaty comes out of the Cold War. It took place in the North Pole, because the shortest route for intercontinental ballistic missiles between the Soviet Union and America was over the North Pole. So the whole world was enmeshed within this struggle. I think another couple of things to say would be that, as I mentioned earlier, some people say it begins earlier, and some people say that it's never quite went away. I just gave you the conventional understanding. And then the last thing to say would be that the war was very hot in some of those places that I mentioned earlier. So many people died. The cold comes from the United States and the Soviet Union, for example, not engaging in general war, which would involve nuclear weapons, which, if it had happened, we probably wouldn't be here speaking about it.
Yeah, probably not. So thank you for that. I think that's a great explanation. But obviously, as you mentioned, there are a lot of specifics. There's a lot that happened. And so I'll leave it a little bit open-ended for either of you now. What are some of the more memorable aspects that I think go beyond those well-known touch points?
I defer to Chris on this one. You want to take it off, Chris, and I can join in?
just briefly, first of all, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I was remiss at saying that at the outset. So excited about kicking off the program, James. We are very grateful to be connected to PMML. And at the same time, I learn something new every time I listen to Andrew, and I learned something from you this evening that I really appreciate. All that said, that's a tough question, but I would say that Andrew got to the heart of the question of what the Cold War was, how it was defined. I would just make the case that I worked in early on in my career on the periphery of the Cold War in places like Central America. There was a war in El Salvador. There were frictions with Nicaragua, all thought as surrogates to a hot war. Yeah, the Nicaraguan regime at the time. So it's a fascinating dynamic that takes us, as Andrew indicated, from Mozambique across the globe. And we'll get into some specifics of the counterintelligence fight, but I think Andrew did a great job as a scene setter. But I just remind the audience that the Cold War took place in peripheral places across the globe. It truly was global in terms of the confrontation between East and West.
And just on that as well, I think some of the memorable aspects that maybe are overlooked, I'll give you an interesting one to start with. So the longest war in the history of the Soviet Union, which is now defunct as an entity, was in Afghanistan. The longest war in the history of the United States, just a couple of months back, longest war in the history of the United States, Afghanistan. So I think that's one interesting parallel, and both of them feed into each other in ways which are a bit more complicated. The second one, this is just an interesting example. The AK-47, most of your listeners will have heard of this. The AK-47, it's invented in 1947, Soviet weapon, hits one of the iconic symbols of the Cold War, and then it goes on to become an iconic symbol of the post 9/11 era. You see photographs of Osama bin Laden with an AK-47. And what's quite interesting is that is now on the flag of 4 countries around the world: Mozambique, Zimbabwe, East Timor, and Burkina Faso. Just think about that. It's on their flags right now. The Mozambique one's interesting because there's an awesome Bob Dylan song that's called Mozambique, and it's meant to be ironic because Mozambique was torn apart by one of these proxy conflicts. And then the final one, I think, that's not discussed that often is all of this takes place against the backdrop of decolonization. I mean, at the end of World War II, you've got you've got like a lot of countries, but nowhere near the amount of countries that eventually become independent through the period that coincides with the Cold War. So this Cold War blended in interesting ways into decolonization. And just think about that. All of the European powers after World War II, in pretty bad shape, pretty beaten up. Almost the whole of Africa at the beginning of the Cold War is under European, some form of European control. The literal states of the Indian Ocean, all the way from Oman and Yemen, all the way over through India into Southeast Asia and Indonesia, all controlled to some level by European powers. During the Cold War, that becomes no longer the case. And you see the West and the East getting involved in various national issues because they've got a dog in the fight in Vietnam or in India or in Pakistan. So that's another thing that's not often discussed, that all of this takes place against the backdrop of decolonization, which is, quite wide-ranging and quite profound.
Yeah, and I think something that both of you hit on, the fact that this is a whole, this is the whole world really that ultimately becomes, affected by the Cold War. it's almost as if really nothing is not impacted, you know, or you couldn't connect in some way to the Cold War and what's happening during this time period. So I'm gonna we'll move over to Colonel Costa here and talk a little bit more about your personal experiences, you know, working in espionage, and working for NATO. You know, how does what you did, you know, really sort of exemplify or relate to Cold War espionage in general, or more specifically?
Yes, so there's a story that takes us to Belgium in 1992. That picture, by the way, a little tongue in cheek, because this program was a vehicle for me to really dig into my personal stuff and go into the storage unit and find some relics of my past. And I discovered this. So I wanted to share with everyone that I was truly young once. And this takes us back to 1992. And I think the story I'm going to tell is a metaphor for the Cold War. And I think we will close the circle a little bit on the discussion of the Cold War with some of the points that Andrew made, to include the possibility for nuclear confrontation. So back in 1992, I was assigned to Belgium as a young counterintelligence agent. So I arrived in Belgium, and my mission was to detect, deny, deter, to investigate the possibility of espionage directed against the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE headquarters. That's a mouthful. That's a few miles away from NATO headquarters. I was responsible for, as an operations officer with my colleagues, to conduct investigations and to ensure that we didn't have spies, in short, operating against the military headquarters. We had to work closely with 16 partners in those days. There are more now, NATO partners. We worked with the CI services of those other 15 countries. So it was much about liaison operations. It was much about investigations, as I've already mentioned. And this was a post 1989, post wall coming down environment. So when did the Cold War end? In many people's minds, it ended when the wall came down. It ended when the Soviet Union broke up. But for many people in NATO, in Belgium in particular, who were assigned there, peace was breaking out all over the place. It made our jobs in the counterintelligence realm so much more challenging, because everyone wanted to do things like partnerships for peace and host, Soviet school children to NATO. We were going much slowly, much more deliberately, because we're counterintelligence people and we're suspicious by nature. All of a sudden, much to our surprise, a media story broke about a spy that was at the heart of NATO headquarters. The spy was purportedly codenamed Topaz, somewhat mysterious. We started putting together the pieces, and we realized there was an investigation, a sensitive investigation, ongoing at NATO headquarters. But in earnest, we had to conduct all kinds of leads, investigative leads, I should add, to try to determine if SHAPE headquarters was penetrated. In other words, was there a spy reaching into the heart of the military headquarters just a few miles away? In the midst of all of that, not finding any evidence to substantiate spy activity at SHAPE, there was an arrest made, and it was reported that a spy couple was arrested for espionage at NATO headquarters. So let me tell you the rest of the story, because it's fascinating, if you bear with me for a moment. Topaz, as it turns out, was an individual by the name of Rainier Rupp, a former top spy recruited in the 1960s. Although he was West German, the East Germans recruited him because he had a left-wing ideological bent. Inexplicably, nobody caught on to that. And by 1977, he was able to get hired at NATO headquarters. He was an economist. He was a very intelligent individual by all accounts. And by 1977, he had recruited his wife, who was a British citizen, to spy along with him. Now, what's important here is he continued to take home secrets, to photograph those secrets in his basement, in his office with the camera. I'll show our guests in just a moment. This went on for 21 years until the wall came down. When the wall came down, his spying stopped, but he still was not revealed until, as I indicated, until he was arrested in 1993. NATO would not have known they had a spy were it not for an East German defector that said there was a spy at NATO headquarters. So I watched all of this play out. It was a fascinating dynamic for me as a young counterintelligence officer to be involved tangentially with the investigation and then do the follow-up damage assessment. But here's the bigger surprise, and it has to do with Rupp's wife, Christiane Rupp. Much to our surprise, when we went to NATO headquarters to coordinate our counterintelligence activities with the NATO Office of Security, Christiane Rupp was our point of contact. She actually worked in the NATO Office of Security. She took our most sensitive intelligence secrets, in some cases at the top secret level, and she secured them ostensibly for her boss, who was the head of NATO Office of Security. Now, interestingly, we were very concerned, obviously, but we discovered that she had stopped spying years before. So when it was revealed that Topaz was her husband, she was stunned, because she thought that her husband had stopped spying against NATO years before, because he had committed to her once the children were born to stop his dangerous spying activity. He continued it nonetheless, and both of them served time in prison. And the last point I think is crucial to make, and it ties into the excellent points that Andrew made. The postscript to this story is Rupp's activities may have, by some judgments, averted a nuclear war. How? Because at the time, in the 1980s, again, to set conditions for our audience and guests, in the 1980s, President Reagan's rhetoric and his activities scared the Soviets. When we had a series of exercises, Able, Archer, and some other exercises you can Google, the Soviets actually believed the United States was getting ready for a first strike, a nuclear strike. And Rupp's, Topaz's intelligence that was provided to the Warsaw Pact calmed the nerves of the Soviet Union. Ultimately, they saw Rupp's intelligence, and Rupp was able, using clandestine tradecraft, just like you see in the movies, to communicate with his handlers. He was able to calm the waters. And in some quarters, people believe that Rupp's spying, as egregious as it was from our perspective, from a US and a Western perspective, as egregious as it was, it calmed the Soviets down, and they were convinced that the United States and the United States and NATO was not going to conduct an attack. And the last thing I want to do, I know I went on a little long here, but I think it's worth it for our audience. Hopefully they can see this. I want to let everyone know that I had an opportunity, because of this program, to go to our archivists and our historians and our staff, and they provided me with the Venus Z camera, which is right here in my gloved hand. This small camera, and you can't see the components of it, but there's a little switch that I'm scared to play with here, a lever that would have controlled the shutter speed. But what Rupp used to do with this not this specific camera, but this model, is he used to rest it on his forehead, lean over, and change one document at a time while he photographed the most sensitive intelligence the West had. So that's just a sliver of the Cold War story that I wanted to share tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I mean, that's a great story, and I think kind of segues a little bit into our next talking point, which is, why is it important to study and discuss the Cold War? And I think, just through what you've just said, really makes sense, because without knowing that story, without knowing his story, we may not understand, was a potential crisis averted through the intelligence that he was passing along. But for either of you, for Dr. Hammond, from your perspective, you're writing a book, or you've got 2 books in the works. For you, why is it important to study and discuss the Cold War?
I mean, very many reasons, James. I think one of the most obvious ones, which has come up a couple of times, is nuclear weapons. The vocabulary, the grammar of nuclear weapons, that was all developed during the Cold War. And during the Cold War, for the first time in human history, the stakes were everything. The stakes were, we don't know with nuclear weapons, because we only have 2 examples to go on. And what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were infinitesimal fractions of what's available now. If there was a general war between the West and the East that involved nuclear weapons, I mean, the stakes would probably have been the biosphere, probably been the future of our species. So those stakes haven't went away. Like 2,500 years ago, when the Athenians and the Spartans were fighting, I mean, sure, it's kind of interesting to study it, but it didn't affect, say, for example, the Western Hemisphere, who won that conflict. But if the legacy of nuclear weapons is that it's all still on the line, the stakes are everything, it's all there. So I just done a brief little research online in one of these nuclear war simulators, James. Mm-hmm. And if a 1 megaton, which isn't that big, if a 1 megaton nuclear weapon went off in downtown Chicago, where you are, well, I mean, you would be gone, like 100% casualties. I love where the Pritzker Institute is, down by the water. It's a great location, but you would be gone, unfortunately. And the fallout would reach places like Detroit and Flint, Michigan. So, I mean, that's one megaton nuclear weapon. Just imagine general nuclear war. I think within the first 3 minutes of nuclear war, the casualties would be where they are now after, 18 months of COVID. So we're talking about really big stakes. So we're still learning how to deal with that, and we're learning how to deal with, within the confines of the Cold War, it was mainly the United States and some of its allies and the Soviet Union that had nuclear weapons. Now we're seeing horizontal proliferation, where more and more countries are getting nuclear weapons, or they're on the nuclear threshold, and the architecture of international relations is struggling to try to deal with some of these developments. So I think that would be one of the big ones. I'm sure Chris has got a few, but I think one of them would also be just, I spoke about ideology earlier. In a simplistic way, you could say that a lot of the 20th century was about a conflict between communism, fascism, and liberalism. Fascism, by and large, at the general level, went away with the end of World War II. But do you know what? The biggest country in the world right now, ostensibly at least, is communist. This isn't something that's like gone away. This struggle for ideology, for how to arrange governments, for levels of individual freedom, this is something that is still continuing. Communism's not went away. It went away in the Soviet Union. It's not went away in China. And we see lots of interesting developments taking place in the South China Sea. And all of that, again, is a direct outgrowth of that. We're seeing the international system change and fluctuate, and we're seeing China increasingly asserting itself, and that's all within a post-Cold War context.
Chris, do you have anything to add to that? I think that was a great comment.
No, that was really comprehensive. I think we could probably take another question. It's your call, but Andrew does a great job of really capturing.
Yeah,
The
no,
answer
I
to the
I
question.
thought that was fantastic, and kind of takes us to our last question here, which, in a sense, is one of the questions we've gotten from our audience. You know, what implication does the Cold War have for today's military, for global affairs? And I think it kind of goes along with this idea of, you just mentioned, with so many nations still with communist governments. Did the Cold War really ever end, or has it become less prominent? Did it just shift in ideology? Did the Cold War just really kind of end with the end of the Soviet Union, and now we're just dealing with something similar, but in different name?
So I'll try to tackle that by saying that in the last 2 weeks, I believe 8 Russians were sent out of Belgium, Brussels, right? Tying into the heart of the Topaz case. They were sent packing for being suspected intelligence officers. I would say that this is a continuation of a war that I believe was won by the West, but this is a new incarnation, a reincarnation, if you will. And what we have to be sure that we do is learn the appropriate lessons that the West garnered during these decades of fighting the Cold War. We forget about the people that were waiting, American service members waiting to potentially deploy to Cuba for an invasion with US forces. And many of those people go unheralded because it didn't happen. Much of the Cold War didn't happen. We didn't have a nuclear confrontation. We have to remember what we learned about counterintelligence, because the Russians are continuing unabated the kind of activities that they conducted throughout the Cold War. What's different, perhaps, is now we have even more capable adversaries. Andrew alluded to China, right? China is the #1 counterintelligence threat in the United States, according to the FBI. So we have a significant amount of challenges, and we have to remember some of those lessons that we learned during the Cold War, because I think they're going to come in handy as we thread the needle, as we continue on this trajectory that we are on. We don't want full-scale deployments of troops from the West to be engaged in combat. We saw how Afghanistan ended recently. So the West has to reconcile some of those lessons, and we have to apply them on a new battlefield. And we haven't even talked about cyber. It's beyond the scope of our discussion tonight. But all of these dynamics make a very, very interesting time in history.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with you. I mean, sort of following up with that, I mean, do you think, could you classify any, of what is happening now, as a Cold War? Are we in a Cold War with China? Or, is cyber warfare the new sort of Cold War? Is that something we can compare to what happened, with the Soviet Union?
Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I can jump in. I mean, I think the first thing to say is just to, say, here be dragons. When you say this is the new Cold War, that's a kind of fraught metaphor to use. So I'd like to just zero in on a couple of aspects of it. So I mentioned earlier what made the Cold War cold. Well, what will hopefully make, if it is a new Cold War, what will hopefully define it will be a cold nature. And by that, all I mean that if the United States, for example, and China have a general nuclear war against each other, the planet and all of us here are going to be just as, trying to find a diplomatic word, not so well off as we would be if Russia and the United States went to war. So this goes back to this nuclear dynamic, this Pax Atomica that came out of World War II. So, this is something that is overlaid just now. And there's been all types of studies. Can you fight a limited nuclear war? can you use tactical nuclear weapons? I mean, the problem is it quickly escalates. So it's, people think that because the Cold War as we know it went away, that we're out of the woods. And, I don't want to depress anybody, but it's going to take people that are engaged with international affairs and that care about peace and security to be involved for us to get through the next century, because we came out of the 20th century by the skin of our nails.
Well, I'm going to sort of, I think that, we're having a good discussion here about, where does the Cold War take us today? Can we even talk about, what's happening today as a Cold War? I think, as you said, we don't know, because we hope that it will be a Cold War, and we hope that there won't be any sort of escalation with what's happening. But to take, we've got a number of questions from our audience, which are great. And if you have any others, certainly specifically related to the Cold War or the museums and what we do, we'd be happy to answer. One of the questions, is regarding the Cold War. What do you think about the role played by, and I might get the name wrong here, so bear with me, Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador to DC for 25 years? What sort of a role did he play in the Cold War?
That's a historian question if I've ever heard of him.
Dobrynin, yeah, he was an interesting figure. I think he was there from the Cuban Missile Crisis all the way through to the late 70s. I've read a number of National Security Council memorandums where he was a participant. So yeah, a really interesting figure. And I guess one of the roles that diplomats play, that people like the Russian ambassador play, is you try to maintain some comms, some level of communication, some place where you can exchange information, either publicly or through back channels or back doors. It's communication. It's trying to make sure that events are in some way managed. So I think that he's a great example because he was there for so long. That's not really something that you see in the State Department. Someone's kicking around for such a long period of time, which goes to the nature of the Soviet system, I guess.
Sure. This one might be another question for you then. But what role, if any, do emigre communities, particularly from places like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, play in Cold War politics?
Do you want to take that, Chris, or do you want?
I'm going to take it. I'm not going to talk about the Baltic states, and then maybe you can think about addressing that if you can, because I'm not an expert on the Baltic states, but I want to use another emigre community as an example, because we've talked about it. We tell the story of Kim Philby's duplicity and his espionage activities. Kim Philby spied for the Soviets. He was purportedly a loyal SIS, Secret Intelligence Service, British officer, and he was actually providing for many years secrets to the Soviets. Philby had access to the closest guarded secrets here in Washington, D.C., in the heart of the Cold War. He was the liaison, and during his liaison activities with a very young CIA's post-Cold War operational planning was to send Albanian emigres back to Albania to overthrow the Hoxha regime in Albania. A bad actor, clearly an enemy of the United States. That was the first post-World War II covert action. And the emigre communities were integral to building a capability. Now, unfortunately, many of those emigres were killed when they went back to Albania, and the operation was an abysmal failure. And this ties back into Kim Philby. Evidence suggests that Kim Philby compromised those operations. So that's another example of not necessarily peripheral operations during the Cold War, but ramifications. It wasn't a hot war, it was covert action, and it went very bad because of the treachery of Kim Philby from a Western perspective. Now, the Baltic countries also were a bit of a battleground, but I don't have enough expertise to really talk about those countries in particular. Maybe you do, Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the main things to say would be just to go back to our discussion on the Cold War. The emigre communities were hugely important, especially in a multicultural country like the United States. Think of the Cuban community in Florida and in other places. So they're hugely important. And I think that for the United States, just casting an eye towards the future and thinking about intelligence and espionage, for human intelligence operations, you need people that can blend in anywhere. And one of America's strengths, I think, and I'm saying this obviously, you can tell from my accent as a non-American, is its diversity. I mean, if you go to Queens in New York, it's the most diverse place on the planet. So those emigre communities, I think, during the Cold War, they were part of, America and its position in the world. And the present, where we are at the moment, they're part of America and its position in the world. And they're always a really interesting dynamic of American domestic and foreign policy.
Well, and I was going to kind of follow up with that and imagine that, those communities would also probably be more scrutinized because of the fact that, especially during the Cold War, where was their loyalty? Who were they loyal to? And I can imagine that certainly that's where, Chris, as you mentioned, espionage and intelligence gathering really pays off and becomes that much more important, is to know, who are people and where do their loyalties lay.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, counterintelligence is really the bedrock of these operations and operational security. But you're exactly right. It's a double-edged sword. You have emigre communities, but it's widely known, many of the communities during these covert actions that we alluded to were penetrated by the hostile intelligence services. I mean, we know that the Uyghur communities across the world are being penetrated by China because China fears exactly these kinds of activities. Somehow the Uyghurs are a threat to China. So they have an active program to go at, they being communist China, to go after these emigre communities. So again, the more things change, the more things are the same. There are lessons that we can learn, but good counterintelligence is a start. And we learned an awful lot about that during the Cold War.
And I think that kind of takes us maybe into a final question here that we've got time for, which is, with intelligence agencies working together, do you see it as being, extremely important? Do you think now intelligence agencies are sharing more information to prevent espionage? Does it seem like that's something that they've learned coming out of the Cold War? Is that only through the sort of interactions amongst each other that they're able to kind of pinpoint and then prevent these types of activities?
You want to take a first pass, Chris?
Yeah, I'll just jump in on this to say the public-private cooperation, I've never seen it stronger. I believe the FBI, they've established several task forces specifically focused on counterintelligence and also counter disinformation. I forget the exact title of that specific task force. It almost doesn't matter. But the point is, you can't build these task forces without having a relationship with businesses across the United States. It is absolutely crucial. So I will just tell you that I am in touch with people that do that work, and I'm very pleased to see that trajectory. And it's very important because counterintelligence is going to be the coin of the realm in this next incarnation of a Cold War, whether it's a new one or an old one, dressed up as a new one. Regardless, I think it's important to know that counterintelligence in cooperation with the private sector is absolutely crucial. What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts there. I think the first one would be, if we think about what we've discussed tonight, James, like let's lasso all of that and bring it back in under control. What we're talking about here basically is a process of globalization that has taken place over the course of the Cold War proper and more recently, technological developments, globalization, and all these different types of changes. And one of the most useful shorthand definitions of globalization is space-time compression. So space and time are compressed. Think about George Washington's ancestors, how long it took them to cross the ocean and how long you can cross it in now. Time is getting compressed, space is getting compressed. Nuclear weapons are a great example of this. And I think that with intelligence, the world is being fused and knitted together even closer through digital, through cyber. We're all connected up to the grid. Think about this, at the beginning of the 20th century, before the invention of the airplane, the front lines were the front lines. When the airplanes come along, then they can bypass the front lines. Nuclear weapons do the same. If you want to think about where we are now, all of us are on the front lines now. The front lines of information and intelligence, to go back to Chris's point, are no longer purely the preserve of the government. Every citizen in this country probably owns a computer or a smartphone or something like that. Their computer is able to be penetrated. They're on the front line. So it's a different dynamic. The front line is extended, it's much broader. And to go back to Chris's point, this means that government and traditional intelligence agencies can't do everything. So just a couple of weeks ago on the museum's podcast, we had an episode where we were talking to some people from Microsoft. They've got a threat intelligence center. So just think about the amount of people in the world that have a Microsoft operating system or a PC, or I've got Word open on my computer right now. So Microsoft are for example, are enmeshed within this in a way that companies weren't necessarily before. Sure, you could help to develop aircraft, and your blueprints could get stolen or something like that. But now the front lines are much broader, and it requires a different type of approach, and that goes back to the public-private aspect that Chris was speaking about a minute or two ago.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think that's sort of a great kind of maybe endpoint for us this evening. Do either one of you have any kind of final statements, final kind of takeaways, last little bits that you'd like to add to our conversation tonight?
Yeah, I do. First of all, James, again, thank you to PMML. This has been fascinating. And for the record, this is the first time Andrew and I have had the opportunity to do a program together. So that's it. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I want to leave with a positive note. So I want to offer this. Prior to 9/11, we had a very diffuse, arguably, intelligence community. There were fiefdoms. 9/11 happened. There were some major bureaucratic changes in how we approach intelligence broadly, and in particular counterterrorism. In the counterterrorism, the enterprise in the United States and with our foreign partners did an extraordinary job of keeping the United States safe from a 9/11. And I am here to note that our foreign partners were instrumental in that. I believe the lessons that we learn, if you follow my logic, with 9/11 will carry over to what Andrew just talked about, to that cooperation. We know as a nation, we can't go at it alone. We cannot do that in the intelligence realm. So we learned that with counterterrorism, and we built up an enterprise to keep this nation safe. Similarly, I believe the lessons that we learned from counterterrorism will cross over and bleed into the counterintelligence front, into the intelligence front more broadly. So we have already embraced lessons learned. So people should, we can be critical, and we should be self-critical of where we've been, particularly on counterterrorism. But at the same time, I think those lessons, the work done by intrepid intelligence officers across the planet, right? And I'm talking principally about our Western partners, right? They have done an extraordinary job. So I thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts.
And thanks, Chris. And I think for me, just really briefly, yeah, it's been great to speak to you. And if any of our listeners have never been to the Pritzker, I would highly recommend going. It's in a great location. If you like military history, it's really awesome. They've got a great library. You can go in and sit there and read a book for a bit. And also, of course, come to the Spy Museum if you're around the Washington area. But I really appreciate the opportunity. I think the final thing that I would just say, just for people that are viewing this, would be, you know, for those that, I'm sure I'm kind of preaching to the converted to some extent here, but this stuff is really important. You know, if there's young people watching this, engage with international affairs. This stuff really matters. Like, think about the Pritzker. I was there not long ago, and there was an exhibition on World War I. World War I is pure international relations. World War II, pure international relations. This is the nature of the world. Apart from maybe the Civil War, almost every combat theatre, every war zone that's in on the pages of the Pritzker Library involves another country. So this involves the whole world. You know, I've got two great uncles that lie in foreign lands because of World War II. This stuff really matters. You know, the fate of humanity is on the line. So please engage with international affairs, think about careers in it, and do what you can to make sure that we get through the next century.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, those are fitting words, I think, to bring our program to a close this evening. And thank you to both of you as well, and to the International Spy Museum. You know, this was, I think, a great conversation, and I really appreciate being a part of this. Thank you also to the International Spy Museum for their support with this program, and thank you to the Pritzker Military Foundation on behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. If you'd like to make a donation to either or both organizations, of course, we would be happy and very grateful to receive them. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you to our participants for being here, and please keep an eye out for future programming.
Thank you very much, James.
Thank you, James.
Good night, everyone.